Well, welcome to our screencast to take the place of class a little bit. Hope you guys have weathered the storm by the time you hear this. I got 2 feet of snow. I think some of you got 3 feet. I just can't even imagine. So it was the worst storm we've gotten in years. So I hope your power's back. It probably is if you're watching this right now. So let's get right into it. Tonight we'll be kind of looking at moving on to summative assessment, large scale assessment. We've been talking about formative assessment, and we'll come back to it. And we'll be mainly because we have a classroom assessment project that we have to get into probably next time. But the summative assessment, large scale assessment, really is something that I've dealt with more than any other assessment over the last 30 years or so as a school leader, and partly teacher leaders, especially PLC leaders, will use large scale assessment, but really everybody will to some extent. And it's changed so much just in the time I've been in education. So we'll talk about that, a little bit about SAS. We'll look at some charts. I was again these slides are for a live class, so I didn't change them. So we won't be able to really do much support for projects except one way here. Talk a bit about the history of testing, and then I want to review Chapter 4 in Poppin and William. William was actually a really good chapter. In fact, so much so that I kind of want to break it up into two. There were some really good instructional / assessment ideas in that chapter, so I hope you had a chance to read it, and you got a little bit of a break. If you didn't read it, you'll have some time to do it, because we're going to have some discussion posts based on tonight's screencast, tonight's class, as well as the readings in the Chapter 4. So I was going to have a duo activity. I was going to have you do this, make a kind of a list of summative assessments in teams of 2 that you give at your level, and then some summative assessments that teachers give not at your level. So most of you are elementary. It looks so different, secondary and elementary. In so many ways, it's really 2 different jobs. And yet we have school districts that are the same. We have principals that sometimes cover middle and elementary, or middle and high. And every level really is very different. But I would say the greatest difference would be between, say, PK to 4 and 5 or 6 through 12. It really is different. Assessment's different. And I'm a little biased, but I spent the year working up to this point in high school, pretty much doing teacher observations, and saw some things I was very impressed with. But pedagogically speaking, there's a lot that secondary teachers can learn from elementary, and vice versa to some extent. Then we were going to make a list of some large-scale assessments, so we'll kind of cover that a little bit in the class as time goes on. Then, of course, we're going to debrief it, but we can't do that since we're not together. So let's talk about large-scale assessments a bit. And again, it's important that you don't have to take notes, because you'll have these slides, and I'll put the slides on Canvas, and of course you have the recording itself. But large-scale assessments have a long history in this country, and we'll talk about the history of assessment. But in the last 10 to 20 years, they've taken on a whole new role, and this type of assessment that's large scale really has a different role altogether. I think most of you who are elementary teachers, and especially primary teachers, you think of assessment as something that you need these days to make sure kids are reading, or make sure kids are growing in math. Although I have to tell you, 15, 20 years ago, we didn't worry nearly as much about that, because our assessments weren't very good, or they weren't as good. Unfortunately, not unfortunately, because maybe we relied more on our own expertise, but we definitely knew, or thought we knew, how well a student was reading or learning math based on just experiencing them. We didn't really have a lot of quantitative information. So now, and this is an old cliche, but it's kind of true, that the data backs up our intuition. So we may, especially if we've been teaching a while, we have intuition about a student, and then we use data to back that up, be it Ames Webb or Dibbles or whatever. The other type of assessment, though, that has a pretty large role, maybe less so in the last couple of years, at least in terms of the press, but those large-scale assessments, in this case, the New Hampshire test, the SAS, and it used to be the NEAP and the NECAP and Smarter Balance, and but the state assessments, which have been around for a while, those were high stakes. And as a principal, they were really high stakes because they printed them in the paper. So when the Concord Monitor would have an article about local schools, my school was in there and my district was in there, as and compared to Concord schools and maybe Warner and Dunbarton and some of the area schools in the capital region. And then the Union Leader, Manchester Union Leader, would do a very large expose on state tests for the whole state. And fortunately, my schools did fairly well. But if they didn't do so well or didn't do well in a particular category, you'd get comments at the next board meeting, or you'd have comments at the town meeting, or I'd get phone calls and emails. So those sort of tests, right or wrong, were high stakes for me. Probably not as much for teachers, because although you can drill down and look at a teacher, the teacher's classroom, that's not something that would go in the newspapers, obviously. Now, I would see it, and maybe I would sit down with the teacher and, without a lot of judgment, would say, what do you think happened here? Or we'd certainly look at individual children, although I never found the state test to be nearly as good an indicator of how well a particular child is doing, but it's a fairly good indicator of how well a district or a school is doing. So, bottom line is large-scale assessments have really changed the landscape, and we'll talk more about that. So what you get is things like, why is this doing this? Let's see if I can do that. There we go. I think I have to put it into the screen in order for it to work. So if you look at this particular chart right here, this is the type, and this is not New Hampshire, but just as an introduction, this is the type of information you're going to get. You're going to get raw scores. That's just how many right out of, how many. It looks like there's 30 questions. Number of students that scored those raw scores. This is obviously dummy data. Percentage of students who score within each raw score. Cumulative percent, and then a percent score. In this case, they're two different things. Over here, this is a term I haven't seen in a long time, stanine. I'm moving this around a little bit. A stanine is sort of a category. It brings down the scores to kind of its lowest or easiest level. So if you're in the 96th to 99th% range, this particular test says that's a stanine of 9. And obviously all the way down here, well below average, 1 to 3% range is stanine of 1. So this is a type of very simple data you'll get, at least initially. Some other stuff you'll get on from time to time, and these are sort of terms. And again, you'll have this. I'm not going to go over every single word here. The raw score is just the numbers answered correctly. Percent correct, that's pretty obvious. Percentile is when you start getting into norming. We'll talk about normed tests and criterion reference tests. That was talked about, I think, on the last screencast, if not live. I can't even remember now. But a normed reference test is a test that is comparing a student or a group of students to the whole. So it's sort of saying, Johnny is scoring in the top 10% of all kids who take this test. That's data, by the way, our gifted and talented parents with gifted and talented kids love to get, which is fine. It's nice to know how you compare to other kids, especially if you want to see what a student's strengths or weaknesses are. A criterion reference test measures a student or group of students against a criteria. So if there's a standard, a state standard or a local standard, it's measuring how well that student or group of students did against that criteria, against that standard. That's what that is. But when you're talking about a percentile, that's almost always the group of students and how they score against a norm. Stain I just explained. In a grade equivalent, a lot do grade equivalents. This is, again, debatable, but if you want to look at what an average third grader should know, the grade equivalent is usually in years and months. So sometimes you'll see 3.11. That means 3 years, 11 months. How accurate is that? There's going to be obviously a degree of measure of of accuracy in that one, and it may not be very accurate, but it gives you a general idea. Obviously, the higher, the better in most cases. Okay, so that's a little bit on just some terms. Skip past that and go to this. Now, the big test we take in our state, as I move myself out of the way. Whoop. See, I do this sometimes. You don't want to see all of me. This is the New Hampshire test. So the SAS is both grade, well, for grades 3 and 8, you do ELA, both in reading and writing and math. Now, if you don't teach third grade, you may not know this, or if you don't have a child in that place. So there's 3 tests, basically, if you're in grades 3 through 8. This is what I would call the core part of the New Hampshire SAS. This is the amount of time, 2 hours, an hour and a half, 2 hours for these 3. And then DLM, that would be if you were taking the special competency-based test for that, so we don't have to worry about that. This here, grades 5, 8, and 11, is for science only. If you happen to be in 8th grade, you take both science, ELA for reading and writing, as well as math. And then grade 11, English language arts, reading, writing, and all math required of all test takers. They actually take the SAT. So the SAT has become the grade 11 test, and that's how that works. All right. So I hope this is big enough. Let's see if I can make it. I don't think I can make this much bigger. Let me just hit play and see what that does here. No, it's not going to work. It's playing on my other screen. Gosh, I can even barely see it. I have to put on my glasses. You might be able to see it better than me. So the way this works here is I'm going to show a bunch of charts that you're going to get back if you take your students take the SAS. And so what's going to happen is you're going to get, and this is just math, for instance, you're going to get a comparison of New Hampshire as well as within individual schools. So here in New Hampshire, this is dummy data. Again, it's not anybody particular. This is grade 6 data in the state assessment. And what they do is they break it up into, in this case, 5 different reporting categories: operations and algebra, number and operations, measurement, modeling, and problem solving, mathematical reasoning. They more or less link up with the NCTM standards. And then you're going to see the percent of each reporting. Now, if we look up, let's see if I can find it here. You're going to have 4 different categories, basically, and they're showing 3 here: low, at or approaching, on or above. So the blue would be obviously the best, on or above. The green is near percentage or approaching it, and obviously low is the orange. And if we had more time, we might say, well, analyze these. And a quick look at this, as you can see that, and they give you an arrow on general strength or weakness. You can see that this is a down red arrow because it's only 14% in the high and 36% in the low. But in this particular reporting category, number and operations, it's much better, 25% in the highest and only 30% in the lowest. So that would be math. And then that's New Hampshire. And then this would show within the district itself. You can see the numbers here. New Hampshire, 3,375 students. That's the whole state. And so it's in this case, the district. It's a demo district. The district compared to the state. In this case, it's the district compared to your particular class that you're getting. Some of you get these. Some of you don't. But it's important that we all talk about them at some point or another. Here's another one, very similar, except this is for reading language arts, or just reading, ELA reading, grade 6. And you can see all these standards are broken out. Now, one thing to think about, and this is where I'm always skeptical, and where NWEA probably does a better job, but I'm skeptical with the whole thing, because kids sometimes will take a 50-question test, and yet it seems like the test can evaluate students on specific standards. I don't know. What I would say is let this be a guide for you. You could always look at last year's test scores if they took them the previous year as a way of getting you ready for your class. But you're going to perhaps know better where they are in certain standards. You may not. depending on some of the techniques that William talks about in chapter 4 as well. Let's go through these here quickly. This one here, now this is an individual one. This is a particular student, and if you're a parent, you have received these before. There's generally 4 levels in the state assessment. It's been that way forever. Level 4, they give a description. The student is highly proficient in applying the English language arts and literacy standards and so on. And then they have the actual score. 713 is in the highest range, and then they have some information on what this means. And again, you can see down here they are above. This is good news for this particular student, and they have descriptions of each of the levels. This was this particular 6th grader on that particular day taking the test. Let's see. This is a science one, and again, the state uses the next gen science standards to decide that. This is more reporting, and this looks like math, ratios and proportional relationships, expressions, equations, geometry, and so on and so forth. Now, this is probably a little more important, also easier to read. There's a term called cut scores. I didn't put that in the vocabulary, but if you've never heard of that, that's a term you will use if you haven't already. A cut score is the different levels, in this case, below proficient, approaching proficient, proficient, and above proficient for each grade. So you can see that, let's just take grade 3, for example, in the ELA reading. If you are hitting a 616, you're above proficient, 587 for proficient, 557 for approaching, and so on. And there's a range. So these are called cut scores, meaning where does the below proficient, above, or rather approaching proficient, proficient, and above proficient, where does it cut off at what point? So you can see here between proficient and above proficient, the cut is 615, and then 616 is above proficient. Then you can see down here, SAS it has similar numbers, although what's interesting is 420 is the bottom of, well, let's look at the high one. 616 is above proficient here for ELA. Math is 455. I don't know the reason for that, except that, remember, these numbers mean nothing. They're raw scores. What counts is what category you're in, or if you're norming, where do that student or group of students sit with everybody else in that grade or that district or the state or the country. So this is definitely more of a criterion reference situation here. So the numbers mean nothing. Who knows why these ended up being higher? I don't know. There's probably a little bit of history with that too. But what counts is where they sit in their cut score. And then these are interesting scores, not really cut scores. But the way writing, and I think it's still done this way, it's also a summer job if you ever want one. The way they judge writing, literally, is they digitize everything a kid writes. They put it on a computer, and they hire people, usually teachers, in the summertime. At least they used to do this in Newmarket when it was a local company. I'm not sure this is done anymore. Of course, now you could just do it from your home. And you have 2 people judged, and this could be done as a school, by the way. Probably not a bad thing for schools to evaluate writing. But what would happen is the schools would, or not the schools, the 2 people would judge one piece of writing, and they would judge what they thought the scores were, in this case on 3 different categories. Statement of purpose, focus, and organization, that's all one dimension or category. Evidence, elaboration, that's sort of the length and how much evidence they put into what they write. And then conventions, editing, spelling, that sort of thing. So these 3 categories each have these many points. So 2 people would do it. Let's say for this dimension, someone said 4, the other person said 3, you'd probably get a 3.5. They would average the 2 together. And that's how writing is done. All right, brief history of testing. I'm going to do a quick cough, turn off my mic here. Okay. So in 1890s, standardized tests finally started coming in. We started realizing that we could test kids, that we could compare kids. And of course, we do a lot of comparing of kids, not one of my favorite things to do. But by 1917, there were literally 84 standardized tests. You've probably heard of the Binet or the Stanford Binet. Alfred Binet was an educator intelligence tester, and that was the beginning of IQ tests. And if you know anything about U.S. history, 1914 to 1917 was World War One, and we started using that in America to figure out where we should put soldiers. It was sort of placing them based on their IQ. So if you had an IQ of 130, you were maybe likely going to be an officer, or at least offered an officer spot. And so use of IQ tests continued well into the 1920s. Into the 1920s and 30s, and even before, immigration grew like crazy. A lot of your grandparents, great grandparents came to America during that time. And we were also trying to figure out what do you do with all these people? We knew we wanted immigrants because we were growing as a country, and obviously it's what made this country the country it is. But we used it to some extent to be able to help leaders, but also help the individuals figure out, where should they be? Should they be, white collar, blue collar, those sort of things. So we grouped students. We developed some vocational education. There was a fair amount of argument after World War I, before World War II, which was 41 to 45, about things like social promotion and retention. We didn't do hardly any retention in those days. Kids just kind of continued year after year. Now, I'm still not a big believer in retention, but at least now we try to get kids ready, and we know if kids aren't ready to go to the next grade necessarily because we do a better job of assessing. Then came, of course, the Depression, where we were just trying to survive, as well as World War II. After World War II, something very important happened. It was called the GI Bill, and it was important for me because my father was a World War II vet, and he, on the GI Bill, he went to Northeastern and got his engineering degree, and then changed the trajectory of the family. Now, all my kids went to college. I went to college. That sort of thing. In 54, this is a little more U.S. history than it is testing right now, but you had the 1954 Brown decision. So testing, because in the Brown versus Board of Education said that separate facilities are inherently unequal. Before that, we were okay with separate things for blacks and whites, for instance, in this case. And now we finally said in 54, and believe me, there was a lot of prejudice. I was born in 61. I remember it in the 60s and 70s. But at least the Supreme Court was moving towards realizing that, geez, there's some pretty crappy black schools and some pretty nice white schools. And so testing served as a way, and I can't really say assessment yet, because to me, assessment's on a higher level in some ways, but testing showed that black kids are just as smart as white kids. They may not have the same opportunities, same advantages, or same experiences, but clearly they were created, on the average, just as smart, just as capable as white kids. In 58, something also very important happened, something called Sputnik. And you should know, as an educator, you should know some of this history. Sputnik was the first time Russia really put a rocket into space. And it made Americans go crazy. It's like, what? Russia beat us to space? So at that point, something called the National Defense Act happened, and there were funds for foreign languages. Oh, here I am again. Math, science, and various federal research funding. So assessment education changed dramatically as a result. So then, as you probably know, in the 60s, it was concern over civil rights. You had Vietnam starting as well, but we also wanted to eliminate poverty. You had the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson. And then Head Start began in 65. So both assessment and education started growing. We started realizing poverty, to a large extent, is a result of kids not being educated, or it's hard to say which drives it first. Poverty almost meant that poorer kids had schools that weren't as good. Now, I'd have to say, in some ways, it's still true. I'm working in a couple districts right now that have very low property values. Their teachers aren't paid as much, therefore, and they're having major school culture problems. So I'm seeing it, and I worked in a town that fortunately did have a fairly high income. So some of these issues have not stopped. All right. Now here's some real testing stuff. By 65, Title I began too. You've heard of Title I, tutoring and work. That actually came from Title I of the ESEA, the Elementary Secondary Education Act. But assessments really weren't carried out very well. We weren't using data to drive anything in those days. Beginning, though, and we're jumping ahead to the 80s, NAEP began. Now, I have an affinity to NAEP. NAEP is the National Assessment of Education Progress. I'm on a committee of about 10 principals for NAEP. And in fact, we just met. I was in DC last week, and we met for 2 days and talked about. I was going to share some of this. I won't bother for this. I'll do it next week. But um, you may have heard that after the pandemic, NAEP scores, in fact, just in the last month or so, were released. And you might have seen, well, a friend of mine, the woman who's the head of the National Statistics Group and NAEP itself, she was everywhere. Meet the Press. She did 25 national interviews. NAEP became actually a little better known because it was everywhere in the national news anyway, um, like Meet the Press, ABC News, NPR. But with bad news, right? The bad news was that students really struggled during the pandemic. No surprise, but then we had data to show that. I'll talk more about NAEP next week. I don't want to bore you with it now, but it is the national test. Kids take it. They don't all take it every year, but every so often, and they do this very, what they call psychometrics, they do it very carefully. Kids take the high school and elementary kids take the NAEP assessment, which looks a lot like state assessments. And then together we could find out how states are doing, how the country's doing, and so on. Now, that says 1070s. It should say 1970s. In the 1970s, we had the beginning of high stakes testing. And I have to tell you, I began teaching in 83. In 83, literally, actually, then when I started, yeah, 83 is when I started teaching. There were really no standards for individual organizations. So, for instance, in social studies, there were no social studies standards. It was basically the front part of a chapter. Really pretty weird, but or a table of contents. That was our curriculum, or standards. It was probably 85, 86 when the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics came out with their first standards book, and that changed everything. After that, not just math, but science. We now have the next gen standards, social studies, history, and of course language arts all developed standards. From there came individual tests as well. And I talked already about criterion reference tests. Let's see here. So in 83, the year I actually started teaching, a particular federal program called A Nation at Risk was developed during the Reagan administration, and it did show that our elementary schools were particularly at risk, that kids were not learning how to read and write, and it did change things. It really was one of those things that well into the 80s began the high stakes tests that districts had to take. And as I mentioned, the late 80s were the beginning of those standards documents from National Council for Social Studies, the math people, science people, and so on. Then No Child Left Behind. Now I might be getting to a point where you remember a little bit. Now that we're in the 2000s, and you might be alive at that point. You were probably students, some of you, during No Child Left Behind, which was bipartisan. You had Ted Kennedy, a Democrat, and you had, George Bush, a Republican president, doing that together. Finally, we started looking at assessment to drive instruction, beginning of those state by state high stake tests. Things like NWEA and STAR began slowly but surely. And then we had things like diagnostic screening, progress monitoring, and I think special ed improved their tools as well. I should mention with STAR and NWEA, the big change there, and this didn't occur until the 2010s, I think, you had adaptive testing, meaning that, you answer a question incorrectly, the next question will be simpler so that over time of the test, you develop a better chance for that. Okay, break. Well, let me fly through the rest of this because if you're not totally bored, I hope you're not. We were going to discuss AARP. We're near implementation time. My word of advice, and I haven't looked at your 2 chapters you had sent me. It's important now that you start implementing, and so you may want to wait till I give you feedback. That's up to you. But either way, it's important for you to, it's already, March 15th. We really have less than 2 months left in the class. You're going to want to start implementing some of that now, whatever it is you're implementing, whether it's a survey, whether you're working with groups of teachers, whatever. So that was the main theme. And then we were going to talk about how you were doing. And and the types of things you actually were doing. So, um, all right, briefly on Popham and William. This was could be a whole excuse me, a whole class. Accountability. Popham talked about certainly the kind of the new role of tests. In some ways, to me, it's the sad role of tests, and you got to do it sometimes. I understand. Um, he also talked, and this is something you should know about. See if I can pull it up. The AERA Joint Standards. This is the American Educational Research Association. I got to get my right document. That's not it. That's not it. Maybe I don't have. Oh, I know. It's on it's on my Google Chrome. Let's see. Right there. So this is the standards, and I don't suggest you read this necessarily. But if anybody ever asks you or ever want to look, it's 2014. It's a little old, but the standards mostly by AERA and APA. These are the standards for testing. So if you are a professional tester, this is where you go. This is the main standards part. So I did want to point that out to you. I think it's been mentioned in the reading before, but clearly Popham brings it up without a doubt. A little bit on judging bias, which you've had before. We've talked about that quite a bit. A little bit of geekdom here. P-values and diff. P-values just is the percentage the average kid gets right. But diff is interesting. It's sort of what diff says, differential item functioning, means that does a question have any bias in it that shows that certain groups of kids will not answer it as well as other questions. So an example might be if I think I've used this example before, if I ask a question about snowblowers to a third grader, the average kid in New Hampshire will probably understand what a snowblower is. The same question to a kid in Florida or Puerto Rico or Texas may have no clue what a snowblower is. Maybe a 10th grader would, but not necessarily a third grader. So non-diff is good. It means that you've developed a question that everybody can answer, at least based on their own status in life, where they've lived and so on. I think of the kid in my 8th grade class who never saw snow. He was, 12, 13 years old, had never seen snow before. When it started snowing in class, and we had a beautiful, nice big window in my classroom, we stopped, and he looked at snow, and he was just fascinated by it, and we took a break. So if I were to ask him questions about shoveling snow, he may not have a clue. So while you'll probably never, unless you want to go into it, write test questions for the NAEP or for the New Hampshire SAS or whatever, you are sometimes writing test questions for your kids or writing assessments. You got to think about the broad nature of your kids. And then there was some information in Popham about accessibility, UDL, and accommodations. Accessibility obviously is, can that student access that information? If they have some sort of disability. UDL is trying to make all tests work for everybody, kind of like the ramp going up to the town hall is good for everybody. A person who can walk can use the ramp. A person in a wheelchair can also use the ramp. Accommodations, if you've ever seen the type of accommodations that are computerized nowadays, they're pretty impressive. You can even have kids highlight. You can make screens bigger, smaller. There's lots of things you can do. Without going into a lot of detail, which we probably should do someday, but not right now. All right, where are we here? Okay, now William had some great stuff, and it's already 34 minutes into this, so I almost feel like we should wait a little bit, but let's go through it. There's going to be some stuff that in the discussion questions around this. One thing he talked about is the TIMS. That's the Trends in International Math and Science. It's actually run by the same people who run NAEP, which is just the national one. There's an international organization that works with us to do this. But when you see in the press that Finland scored higher than any other country, or Hong Kong, or Japan, it comes from the TIMS. This is the international test that's out there. William also talked about just thinking deeper. I think that was the theme of the whole chapter. So I'll give you an example from my day today. One of the things I couldn't do at NAPE is there's this what they do with us sometimes is they ask us questions that they give for surveys. This is the federal government and the NCES, the National Council of Educational Statistics, and they use us as guinea pigs, and they ask us about how we feel about certain questions. Like the question today was about hybrid virtual learning, in-person learning, and so on in schools. And they wanted me not just to answer the question, but to do it in a very verbal style. So I would, and of course, being a talker was not hard for me. So I would actually, instead of thinking things, I would think it and actually say it out loud. So the point is, they were looking not just at my answer, but they were looking at how I came up with it, and that because they're qualitative data people, and then they would use that information to make better questions, basically. So if there's one thing you can learn from William's chapter, and that is that when you have discussion in a class, don't just look for the right answer, and don't just try to get the right answer and move on. Listen to what the student's saying because you're probably going to get an insight into their thinking, and that's what really counts. I'll fly through this a little bit here. IRE, initiation, response, evaluation. That's kind of how we do things in classrooms, right? So we initiate, we ask for a response, and we evaluate the kid's answer. A lot of teacher talk. You probably saw the statistics and even higher in some of the Asian countries on teacher talk versus student talk. And then the percentage of type of questions. I think I wrote that down somewhere in a document. Let's see here. So 57% of questions, according to William, or the study he was citing, are managerial questions. Like did you hand in the paper? Did you hand it in the right place? Did you put your name up at the top? A third of those questions were general recall of information. What's the capital of Connecticut? Only 8% of the questions that teachers asked from this study required analysis from the student. They were mostly just, either managerial or recall of information. And overall, less than 10% caused any new learning for the student. So this is where there's a Venn diagram between instruction and assessment, or should be, right? If we separate those two things, if instruction is just call and response, I feed your brain, you kick back information, whether it's verbally or on a test. And assessment is that part of the test. Instead, be assessing kids, listening to their understanding, and working on their thinking. That's crazy important. They talked about the Matthew effect. I'm going to ask that in a discussion question. And then there's great stuff about hand raising, and how some teachers shouldn't have their kids raise hands at all, because what you get is, you get the Matthew effect, meaning and I'll read it here. It's Matthew 25:29. For all those who have, more is given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. So it's kind of the Robin Hood thing, right? Well, it's actually the opposite of Robin Hood. Those who are rich get richer, and those who are poor get poorer. It's sort of anti-Robin Hood. That's called the Matthew effect, from the Gospel of Matthew is why they call it that. A little religious stuff in class today. So, instead, some teachers, pose the question, pause for 5 seconds. They pounce on a student, meaning they ask a student for, maybe a random student. They look for the answer, and then they bounce that student's answer to another student. What I saw this year in my high school classes is an awful lot of call and response, meaning that the teacher wanted the right answer. If they didn't get the right answer, they say, "Ooh, almost," instead of maybe going a different direction or thinking about the student's thinking. And that's kind of where William was at with that. And so instead, change the classroom contract. I like that term. Kids know what the contract is. They know that, for instance, if I sit in the back and kind of keep my head down and don't raise my hand, the teacher's not going to call on me. Instead, maybe the contract needs to change so that, and I think teachers do this so much better now. Either it's a popsicle stick or some other route. Everybody speaks during class. And you call on kids, whether they have a hand up or not, or you just say, "Don't raise your hands. I'm going to call on you." Now, that could be seen as uncaring, but it's all in how you deal with it. The respectfulness of how you deal with a wrong answer, or how you deal with the kid that says, "Oh, I just don't know. I don't know." And so there were some interesting things there too on how you respond to the "I don't know." So in general, focus on the understanding rather than the answer itself. He talked about evaluative listening, meaning I'm just listening for the right answer, versus interpretive listening. I'm listening, well, the right answer is fine, but I'm also listening for the understanding level because most things in life, as you know, are kind of gray. And even a right answer may not be completely right, or even a wrong answer may not be completely wrong. There's shades of goodness in everything. Okay. It's too bad. I think this is great discussion stuff if we can ever get to it. Let's see if I can get to the bottom slide here. I may have to move it to another screen and then bring it back. All right. So assignment wise, and I have to think about this because now that we didn't meet, I'm going to reassign chapter 4. There's so much good stuff in there. And I had read this in a while, and I was surprised, frankly, how much good stuff was in chapter 4. We'll have a discussion post on that. We'll do a discussion post on tonight's 45-minute screencast, which, by the way, takes me forever to upload to YouTube. And hopefully you're still with me. I'll respond to your sections 3 and 4 in AARP in the next couple days. You work on edits once I give you back some feedback and begin implementing. Please touch base with me. I feel like I don't do my job well enough because we're not together that often and really haven't had a lot of people reach out, which is probably a good sign. Maybe everything is understandable. Remember, parts 5 and 6 of the Action Research Project, AARP, is after you implement. So you really can't do that quite yet. Other advice I would have is look over the digital portfolio, keep that up to date. You don't want to do it at the end because then it's not really meaningful and you'll forget things. And although we didn't talk about it, look at the classroom assessment project just to get familiar with it. We'll have time. We'll try to finish these chapters by May. We may not get to every single chapter in these two books. The other thing is the competency book that we haven't gotten to yet. We'll definitely review that as well. I think that's it. So hopefully this helped. Hopefully this wasn't worse than showing up at class. I hope you dig yourself out of everything you need to dig yourself out of. I had much more I wanted to go over tonight, but as usual, even as a screencast, there's just too much information. So we'll move on, and I'll see you. Actually, I won't see you definitely until now, the 29th of March, I'm pretty sure. Let me just check that just to make sure. In my little trick here, I have what to call a dashboard for Keen, and then I have a document that has classes, and the answer is, yeah, March 29th. You probably knew that, and you were saying March 29th out loud. All right, catch you later, guys. Thank you for everything, and please reach out anytime you need anything. Okay? Take care.